Data mining design. The other day I was doing a Google search on mountain climbing, and I honed in on this one particular website, and then I noticed on the right-hand side of the page there were these advertisements all having to do with purchasing mountain equipment. How did they target me as one of these people who's interested in those products? Well, most likely they used data mining. They found out what keywords I used to get to that web page, and then they dug out information as far as what products I would probably be interested in. Companies use data mining all the time. Another example is if you go online and purchase books, you'll see related books as well. In this nugget, we'll talk about the importance of our data mining design. We'll start off with choosing data sources, and it can be from multiple sources actually. You can even grab your data from analysis services if you'd like, instead of a table. Once you have that data, you are going to have to clean up that data, and that's where we talk about staging the data. For example, you might have a table with lots of information in there, but there might be gaps in the information. You might want to populate that data with something. You also might want to get rid of what we call outliers. If you have a range of values in a table, and then you have a particularly high or low value, that's what we call an outlier. I'll show you how to clean that up, and there's several different options for that. And then we'll get into the mining algorithms that you can use. We'll talk about which scenarios are best for particular algorithms. And then the last thing I'll show you is how to use the Microsoft Excel add-on. You can actually implement data mining through Microsoft Excel, and what that gives you is that now you can save these reports in an Excel spreadsheet or in an image format. Let's get started with choosing our data sources. We're going to first of all start off with an empty Business Intelligence Development Studio, and then we'll create a new project in there. So let's just go ahead and say File, New, Project, and make sure it's Analysis Services, and we'll call this Data Mining Design. And here on the right-hand side, we have data sources. Now, the data source, you're going to have a primary one, but you can also have secondary data sources, which I'll show you in a moment. On the left-hand side here, I have data sources that I have created from connections earlier. If what you're looking for isn't in here, then you can always click on New. The name of my server is Julie1, and the name of my underlying database is AdventureWorks DW2008, so mine is already in there. Note that down here you can also create a data source based on another object, such as an SSAS cube. And I'm going to use a service account instead of like a Windows username and password, and I'll just stick with the default data source name. And there we have it. Okay, so if I move this over here a little bit, it's a little easier to see. From that data source, you can now create numerous data source views. And the data source view is just selecting which tables you're interested in. So I'm going to right-click on here and create the new data source view. There it is. Hit Next. Here are our available objects. Now, this is not just limited to tables. These are actually tables, views, and synonyms. And so what we're doing is we're looking for the table that is our training table. In other words, it's the table that contains all the data, and what we can do is create mining models on that, which gives us information such as which attributes are related to other attributes. And we can also predict things if we're dealing with time series. Okay, so let's go ahead and choose the V target mail. And the other table that we want to select is our prospective buyer, and that's going to be for our testing set. The testing set is just a set of data that we want to apply a mining model to so we can predict things. So in our particular case, the prospective buyer pretty much has most of the columns that target mail does, except it doesn't have the column that says whether or not somebody purchased a bike, because they're just a prospective buyer. But using the mining model, we can say yes or no, do we think that they're going to purchase a bike. If you click on either of those and say Add Related Tables, you can quickly choose the tables that have foreign keys pointing to them, but we're not going to need anything else there. Okay, so now we can hit Next. Oh, and by the way, here's this filter here. If you know what the name of the table is, or part of the name, you can always type that in there and hit this icon, and it will drill down to the matches. But since we didn't have that many tables, it was just easy just to find them. So let's hit Next. And here's the name of our data source. We'll just call this AdventureWorks. Those are the tables in there, and then we'll hit Finish. Now, what if we wanted to add tables from other sources? Well, first of all, we would add the source and then add that source to the view. In other words, I could right-click on here and say New Data Source. And instead of selecting AdventureWorks DW 2008, maybe I just want to select AdventureWorks DW, which is a different database. So I could hit Next on there, once again use the service account, and hit Finish. And you'll see now that I have two different data sources. I can now double-click on this data source view. If I want to add a table to it, I simply right-click on here and say Add Remove Tables. And you'll see that there's this drop-down right here, and you can select what you're interested in. And so you'll notice that there's yet another table here called V Target Mail. You could move that over there, and you can distinguish them because this is fully qualified here. Okay, so that's how you would do that. For right now, we're just going to stick with these two different views from the original data source. Now, in addition to just adding tables as is, you can actually create your own what we call named queries. You can join together many tables, and they can even come from different databases. So to do that, you just right-click on that pane right there and say New Named Query, and just give it a name. For example, I might call mine Shoppers, and then you can just right-click on here and you can use a graphical interface to create the underlying SQL statement. So here we're adding tables. I might want to grab my, it's actually a view. If I go to my V Target Mail right there, and close, we can then select whatever columns we want to. So I might just grab, for example, the first name and the last name, as well as their marital status. And so the benefit of this is that you can just narrow it down, and you can even concatenate columns if you want to. So here I'll put yearly income, maybe gender in there, a couple other things. So yes, we're interested in total children, whether or not they own a house, and we also want to know their age and whether they're a bike buyer. And instead of having two separate columns for first name and last name, you might want to concatenate them. So you can put the plus operator there, maybe separate them by a space. So now you'll see under Tables, it shows up as a table, and here are the different columns. You can then base your mining structure on that named query. We're going to do an example of creating a mining structure and then a couple mining models within that structure. We'll explore those mining models, and then we'll look at that same information through Excel. At this point, we want to create a mining structure. A mining structure just defines the columns that our mining is based on. So if we say New Mining Structure, we get the Data Mining Wizard. We can tell it to not show the page again. And we can get this information from a database or a data warehouse or from an existing cube that we created. I'm going to choose the first option. And we'll talk about these different data mining techniques. One of the most common ones is the Microsoft Decision Tree, and it essentially creates a tree for you, and you can see what the most important deciding factor is for whether somebody purchased a bicycle. You can also create a mining structure with no models and then create a model later to add to it. So there's our data source view that we created. Hit Next. And here are our input tables. In other words, what is our training data? Well, it's not prospective buyer. Prospective buyer is going to be the testing data. We can either use Shoppers, which we just created with the named query, or we can use V Target Mail. I'm going to choose V Target Mail for my case table, and you'll see that there's this other column here called Nested. You can actually have one table nested inside of another in your mining structure. An example of that would be if you have a bunch of customers and maybe each of those customers had one or more purchases. It's a containment relationship. But in our case, we don't have any kind of containment relationship, so we can just leave that blank. I'm going to hit Next. And then here we specify the key, input, and prediction. The first thing that I want to do is determine which column is the column that I'm trying to predict. Well, bike buyer is the one that I'm really interested in. So I'm going to check on prediction right there, and then we can click this button right here that suggests what the input tables are. And what this does is it looks at the metadata for the table and it makes suggestions as to which columns are related to that particular column. Okay, so it looks like age is highly related to it, and that's the only one. We can hit OK, and then we can specify other input columns as well. For example, if I want to see if there's a relationship between commute distance and bike buyer, I can click on that. Let's see also if there's any relationship between that and maybe gender, whether or not they own a home, marital status, maybe the number of cars owned, number of children at home. I mean, if somebody has 8 kids at home, they probably aren't going to be out riding a bike that much. Okay, so yearly income, that might have an influence on whether they purchase a bike as well. So now we need to specify what is the key. In other words, what is the primary key for this table? Well, it's the customer key, and you'll see that it's already checked here for us. So we'll just hit Next. Then here we specify whether it's a continuous or discrete column. A continuous is a range of values. For example, if we have a column which represents salaries, that's continuous. If we have a column representing gender, that would be discrete. You can just click on Detect to specify that whether it's a continuous or discrete, and it also guesses what the data type is. Then we can hit Next. Percentage of data for testing. By default, it's 30%, and usually that's a safe value. However, if you have millions of records in your table, you want to make the sampling maybe a little bit smaller, maybe 10%. You can also give a maximum number of cases in the testing data set to put a cap on that. So here I might say, you know, let's minimize it to 2,000 cases. Then we hit Next, and here's our mining structure name. I'll just stick with the default. And the mining model name, let's just call this Decision Tree. Now there's this checkbox here that allows drill through, and what that does is drilling through lets you not only look at the general information for population, but it also lets you drill through and see the details for those people. So I'm going to check on that, and later we can add other columns so we can see more detailed information. Let's hit Next. Okay, so there's our mining structure. We can now double click on that, and you'll see under Mining Models that there's our decision tree, and here we can add other mining models as well. If you just right click on there and say New Mining Model, let's call this Clustering. So these are the only 2 mining models we're going to do for right now. And here we'll choose Microsoft Clustering. And all clustering does is it groups records together by different attributes. So the items in a cluster are highly related to each other. We'll hit OK on there. Notice that we didn't have to redefine the structure because the structure is already defined once. So you define the structure once and you can have multiple models that are based on that structure. So let's say I wanted to go back to my mining structure and modify this. I could. You'll notice that right now my structure doesn't include any detailed information such as the address, email, or phone number. Those would probably be important if we want to use drill through. So I'm just going to right click on here and we're going to add a column. And here we can add here the email address and do that for the address. Almost done. And let's grab that phone number. And now you'll see that information down there. At this point, we can then go to our model viewer, and here's our decision tree. It wants us to build and deploy the project first, so we'll just say yes on there. And then we can see how the attributes relate to each other. Now it asks us to process it. We'll say yes to that. And this should just take a few seconds. It really depends on how many records you're processing and how many attributes you're including in there.